Well, hey there, welcome in for another exciting edition of Drummer Daily. My name's Daniel, and I am so pumped that you could join me again to talk about drumming, pursuing a drumming career, becoming a better drummer, basically anything that has anything to do with drumming. This is the place for you. So today I've got a question. We're bouncing right back after episode 150, where I kind of took a breath, took a break, and talked about something that I think was a little bit bigger than any one specific question, just about not giving up. If you haven't seen the success that you're looking for as a professional drummer or pursuing being a professional drummer, some motivation for you and some ideas for how you can move forward. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I highly suggest you go back and listen to it. That's episode number 150. So you can go check that one out at danielhadaway.com/150. Or if you're listening, obviously, on some kind of podcasting software, you can probably just go back to the feed and find that episode. But today we're going to talk about a question we got in through the email. This one comes from Phil. And Phil asks, he says, hey, how do you decide when it's time to change drum heads? And this is an excellent question. And it's a great question for me to get right about now, because I actually just changed my snare drum head, I want to say maybe, as I'm recording this, maybe 3 or 4 days ago. So I had this fresh on my mind, and I definitely put some decision making into the process. It wasn't one of those things where, I had the drum head sitting around, the new drum head sitting around waiting to be put on the snare for months even, really. In fact, I actually have a couple of sets of replacement heads for all of my drums, just waiting when I'm ready to replace them. They're already here at my house. I don't have to go out and buy them or anything. They're ready to go. So I definitely was waiting to the right time. And so I definitely put some thought into deciding when it was the right time to change drum heads. So I just thought about this. So this is a great question to answer today. So there's a couple of things that are always good signs that it's time to change a drum head. And I'm going to talk about batter heads first, the ones that actually get hit by sticks, or if it's a kick drum, with the beater, the head that gets hit. And there's a couple of obvious things, obviously, that you want to look for on the front end. These are the giveaways that it's time to switch heads, and these are probably things you already know, like denting in the head. If there's little divots in the head from your playing, if you've dented a head, doesn't matter how long you've had the head on the drum, chances are it's time to switch those out, because that means the head is damaged. And a lot of times, especially if you tune a drum really high, if you tune, like for example, if you tune your snare drum really, really high, I've learned, because I definitely did that. I was in some more rock and roll type bands when I was younger. I definitely learned that when I tuned my snare drum higher, it would actually stretch some of those dents out of the head. And so I wouldn't really have a good perspective on how badly I was actually damaging the snare drum. Until sometimes I'd be like, all right, I'm going to switch this head out. I don't think it's time, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. And when I would loosen up the snare drum head, all of a sudden you'd see this big dent right in the middle of the snare drum head and be like, whoa, that was a big dent. And my head was a lot more damaged than I thought it was. So a good way to find out if you're not sure if that's happened to you is just take a minute to loosen your snare drum head, or loosen any of your heads, and look and see if you see those dents when the head is pretty much as loose as it can go, way below what you would normally play it, or even really get a good sound out of it. Just loosen that head up and look and see if it dents in anywhere in the middle. And if it does, that's a good indication that it's time to switch it up. Now, above and beyond that, of course, any kind of damage, I don't need to go on about that. Any kind of damage to the head obviously is going to mean it's time to do it. Another thing, if you really think that you are pretty darn good at tuning a drum, whatever drum it is, but you just can't seem to crack this drum anymore. You can't seem to figure out how to tune this drum now. For some reason, it's just gone to where it just seems impossible to get it to really sound great. That's another indication that maybe the head is stretched out beyond the point at which it can really respond to your tuning the way that you'd expect. So things just happen over time. The way, there's so many dynamics and variables in playing a drum and tuning a drum that sometimes the head just ends up getting stretched out in a crooked way or not evenly. And when that happens, it's time to switch the head. So just if a drum becomes, I would say, more difficult to tune than you expect it to be, and you kind of know your drums, that's another good sign. But I didn't use any of those factors to decide when it was time for me to change my snare drum head recently. And this is really these days, because I don't hit very hard as a drummer, and for whatever reason, maybe the technology inside these snare drum heads or these drum heads in general is just so good that things don't stretch out weirdly most of the time now. But there is one other factor that I use to basically decide when it's time to switch any drum head, and definitely a snare drum head that gets hit so many times. And that is, it's kind of hard to explain, but really, when I hit the snare drum or hit any drum, it just doesn't have that really crisp, high-end attack that I'm used to. And I don't mean it's tuned up high, I don't mean a tone. I mean, there's that really, the hard, very first sound you hear when the sound of the stick hitting the head, that attack, that punchiness if it's a kick drum, or that really sharp, crisp, strong sound coming from a snare drum, that attack sound. If those things aren't there, then it's time to change drum heads. And this is something you have to you gotta get used to the sound of your drums. You really gotta know your drums, your snare, your toms, your kick drum. You really have to get to know what your drums sound like. But if you have your own drums for any amount of time and you play them fairly frequently, you might start to get this inkling, and you got to listen to your gut, because this is what it was. My snare drum head was long overdue for being changed out, and now that I've switched it to a new head, I definitely am like, oh wow, yeah, this is such a difference, night and day difference. I can't believe I waited so long to switch out my drum head. But the problem is that it's just like that old, it's like that old saying about the frog in a boiling pot of water, which I don't know who boils frogs. It sounds awful and cruel and terrible, but it's a saying. But they're like, if you want to boil a frog, you don't throw it in hot water because it'll jump out. You put it in cold water, then you slowly turn the heat up. The idea being that things sneak up on you. And so definitely with drums, as they slowly wear over time, the drum heads slowly wear over time, it can make it hard to really be able to tell what to expect from your drum head, and what really is kind of ground, baseline, ground level for what your snare drum or what your drums can sound like. And so over time, it just kind of, as that head stretches out, you don't really realize that the sound is changing and it's not as good as it once was. So that's some good tips for changing it. The most important thing is if that drum just isn't sounding the way it used to, and you can't tune your way out of it, it's time to change that snare drum, or I keep saying snare drums because that's what I just did, but this goes for any drum. Now the bottom heads are so tough. They're still tough for me to figure out. And I will say this, that once you get a good, especially on toms, once you get that bottom head put in place and it's seated really well and it's really, working well, you still are gonna have to tune it, every once in a while and keep it, in tune. But man, I really don't like changing out bottom heads on toms, especially because I feel like once you get to a good spot, it's so hard to get it back there again. But I will say that especially when I'm really busy as a drummer, I'm touring or I'm playing a lot of sessions, and the drums are getting a lot of work, basically a lot of play time, I will change out the bottom head once every, I think every 3 changes of the top head. So for whatever head, whatever drum it's on. So if it's a rack tom, every 3rd time that I change the batter head, I'm going to change that resonant head as well. And there's some people who are going to disagree with me. They're going to say, no, you should change it more often. Or some people are going to say you should never change it. But that's just what I do. And so I do think it's important to change those bottom heads every once in a while. But it's definitely not, they're not getting worn out as much as the heads that you're hitting. Now, I will say that I do have this kind of romantic kind of view of the idea of having these drums with these, I see some guys playing drums online and they have these old drums that have these heads that are, they used to be white, but they've turned black in the middle from all the stick marks, and they're worn in so well and they still sound great. And maybe someday I'll get there with that, but I just, as much as I like the idea of having these old heads that I've never changed or whatever, I just can't sacrifice my sound to do it, because most of the time people aren't looking at my drum heads, they're listening to my playing, and so it doesn't really matter. And I'm enjoying right now, I have the kind of that thing built up a little bit on my toms, on my A&F kit, the main kit that I play right now. But I had that going on my snare, and like I said, I changed that snare drum head, and it definitely was time to do that. So I'm very glad that I did that. And I'm probably gonna have to bite the bullet here soon and change out my tom heads as well. Now, kick drum heads are, again, something really tough. I know kick drum heads are so expensive, and that makes it even harder to change out. And I will say that every time I've changed a kick drum head, as long as I'm replacing the head with the same head, that's probably the one that I'm the most underwhelmed by as far as how it sounds, as far as the difference it makes. I don't think it really makes as much of a difference as the other heads do. And again, someone's probably going to get angry and tell me that I'm wrong about this, but this is just in my experience. Changing out, especially like definitely the front kick drum head. I wouldn't change the front kick drum head, honestly. This is just me again, but I don't change the front kick drum head unless it's damaged or I want it to look different. Aesthetics, really. That's the only reason why I change the front kick drum head. And the batter head, again, I just don't hear much difference most of the time. But again, I don't play very hard. So you're gonna have to look and see if you're damaging your kick drum head. The same thing, eventually I know kick drum heads do get dented in where they get hit over and over again. And kick drum heads are unique because that's the one drum that, once you put your kick drum pedal on, you're hitting the exact same spot on the drum every single time you play it. That kick drum beater is not bouncing around different parts of the head. It's sticking to that one little spot and it's hitting it over and over again. So that can wear out the head a little bit more often, but again, that's the least exciting head to replace, and I understand it. It's so expensive, and it also you get the least amount of difference. So that's the one I would hold off on the longest, but I still think you should do it. So I think I've covered everything. I hope that helps you in deciding when it's a good idea for you to change your drum heads. And I'm so excited that you've joined me. If you have a question or an idea for a topic that you'd like for me to cover here on the podcast on Drummer Daily, send me an email, daniel@danielhadaway.com, or you can go to danielhadaway.com and just find that little contact button, fill out the form and email me that way if that's easier for you to remember. And that's it. So, hey, by the way, my name is spelled Daniel. I hope you know how to spell Daniel. My last name is spelled Hadaway, Hadaway, just like it sounds. That's how it's spelled. So you can go check me out, danielhadaway.com or daniel@danielhadaway.com. All right, thanks for joining me today, and I can't wait to talk to you again tomorrow on Drummer Daily. Bye for now.